the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, Lord, now and always.
Amen.
And the sermon today has quite a bit to do with words and meditations, and especially on the topic of faith. So a good place to begin might be with us imagining a scene near the gates of an old city in Old Testament times, where people traditionally gathered and discussed the important matters. Our church gatherings now discuss things secular society shies away from, doesn't it? For things like faith and good news and loving service. In a way, that image can help us picture Jesus as he roamed the land, telling parables and having conversations with people who would come up, and often they'd begin with the question with, but, or how? Of course, we have fancy electronic methods of communication today, but do we really interact and discuss, or do we simply retweet and never dialogue, not dig down? Is our modern communication sincere enough? Does it encourage and build up, or does it hurt and tear people down? I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that lived first in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and now, I am sure, lives in you. We should be encouraged like this and encourage others, just as Paul was encouraging Timothy in our epistle reading. But what is faith? And what do we mean by having sincere faith? And as our gospel reading today began, how do we increase our faith? It was an important request that the apostles made of Jesus to increase their faith. And understandable, because it came at a time when the challenges of being a disciple were being made clear. When you have a moment, I suggest reading the start of chapter 17 about the sorrows and millstones. Christianity is not just some philosophy that, in the right circumstances, we can nod our heads and agree with. There is faith, and so a strength and a calling that goes with it. If you were listening carefully for an answer from Jesus to that important request from the disciples to increase their faith, the answer might have been difficult to hear. Jesus responds with, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, then you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. That analogy of a little faith, like a very little mustard seed, being able to do so much, is a powerful picture. And certainly we are told that faith can move mountains as well as trees. But is Jesus simply saying, a tiny faith goes a long way, so you don't need any more? No, I don't think that was what was meant. Jesus goes on to frame the need for faith in terms of a servant's job. What does this tell us? We need to beware of the biases, the coloured meanings that can occur from the words we use. In the English language, we have one word, faith, that has two meanings. And in some languages, the meanings are given two different words. What did Jesus mean? And was it the same meaning the apostles had in mind when they asked? Faith could bring to mind a faithful servant and fidelity. That meaning goes with one Latin word for faith, fide. Or faith could bring to mind creeds, those affirmations of our faith in fine detail, such as the Apostles' Creed. The word has come to be associated with doctrine and, let's face it, with divisions among Christians. back to what Jesus said in that. It wasn't said in English or Latin. It was written down in the Gospel using Greek, but probably originally said in Aramaic or maybe Hebrew. I have a list of 9 words used in the Old Testament that all translate to our word faith. Now, if any of you are interested, you can come and talk to me afterwards about them. They're very, very interesting. Now, one word is Yahal. Gosh, pity I haven't got trees up here to help me pronounce all these words. Yahal, which means wait or hope faithfully, such as used in 2 Kings when the king of Israel had to Yahal for God's help when besieged by Syria. Another interesting one is Umanah, which was used in the last verse of today's Old Testament reading in Habakkuk. Does knowing all that complex detail make it too hard to work out what faith means in today's gospel, for example? No, Jesus talks about faith in the context of the service of a servant. So it's closer to the fide meaning. But does that entirely answer the question of what is faith, let alone how do we increase it? The reality is there are important questions like this that are not easily answered in a sermon, even an hour-long sermon like this one. Because you are paying attention, they are questions we all keep pondering through our lives. Part of the answer will be that faith is dynamic. It does increase, and it increases with use. But important questions like faith and love and peace are what we need to keep thinking about and praying about, discussing with others, storing up and passing on to those around us when it helps. Some may recall a series of cartoons by Kim from about 60 years ago, all headed Love Is. They kept going for decades. As with love, there are many, many definitions and examples of what faith is, if we look and think. Some examples can be the topic of Bible studies, our modern equivalent of gatherings at the city gates, and sometimes from a very personal experience or thoughts we might have while waiting for our waiter to come. Thoughts like, is it only us that need faith in God, or did Jesus need faith in that so very costly course of action for our salvation? Or can building a house on a solid foundation be both science and faith at the same time? Is the faith in the rope of a mountain climber something that comes from nowhere, or is it based on past experience? And is the opposite of faith not doubt or science, but uncaringness and apathy? These aren't questions the sermon or any sermon can answer for everyone. This is because when faith grows, it needs to grow within each new set of surroundings that encompasses our life at the moment. So we need to continually think about faith, trying to flourish like a flower. So it's up to each one of us individually to foster its growth, to think about it, appreciate it. But it remains our job to also share and use it with and for others. It comes down to faith lived rather than faith just heard. Remember what Jesus did in his life work and asked us to do as faithful servants. Now, if anyone asks you what today's sermon was about, you might say the importance of faith. But if you ask, so what did the sermon say faith was? I hope you will say that there wasn't one short, snappy definition that covered faith. Sure, there are ways to look at how some words we use might bias our thinking, and how looking at the context is always a good idea in the Bible. But in the end, it comes down to the same challenge carried by so many other important words: love and peace and wisdom and hope. We need to see and think about all the very many ways it arrives in our lives, and let our words and prayers always encourage growth in those around us and growth in ourselves.